When I first called Rami to book his recording studio, I didn't tell him what the podcast was about because I wasn't sure how he would feel about the subject matter. Rami was incredibly welcoming and accommodating from that very first phone call, but I was curious about what he thought once we started recording. I was sure that at least some of the conversations had been confronting, and I wanted to know how these interviews were received by a listener who didn't identify as fat. In between takes, Rami and I had some really meaningful and complicated conversations about fatness, our relationships to our bodies, and how we navigate these subjects with our friends, partners, and families. To kick off season 2, we dive into these topics and broaden the conversation to explore our messy, sensitive, and at times contradictory perspectives.
My name is Rami Mikhail. My pronouns are he, him. And your second question was how to identify?
Yes, I hate asking, what do you do for work? Because it feels like you're equating someone's identity with what they do under the constraints of capitalism. So instead, I just ask people to introduce themselves and say whatever it is they want to identify as or identify with.
Okay. Well, I really love my work. I actually have issues with calling it work sometimes. So I'm just going to say that I do video production, video marketing. And for everyone watching and listening, and you'll probably do this in your intro, but I've produced these podcasts for season 1. So, but yeah, I do just anything video excites me. Apart from that, I'm a bit of a sushi addict.
Ooh.
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else that really sums me up, to be honest.
Well, then I appreciate it. You're giving a very clear picture of
Yeah,
who you are.
totally. Video and sushi, let's go.
And I'm glad you say how much you love your work, because that is obviously your relationship to the podcast and to me, how I met you. And why I want to begin season 2 with an interview with you is because of how we began this work together and sort of realizing that this was such a good opportunity to ask for a really interesting perspective that I think a lot of listeners likely have, and also to sort of ask you questions that a lot of listeners might want to be asking but might feel afraid to. So this is a really unique opportunity. And I do also want to say that you're very good at your job. So obviously this podcast looks and sounds great.
You.
But when we met and I emailed you to book the space and I was asking about accessibility, you were really sort of on the ball with it. And you were very clear and forthright. You were very familiar with those types of questions, which I wasn't anticipating. When I first reached out to you, I had never heard of you before, had never worked with you before, and so I didn't know what your politics were going to be at all, but especially around bodies and all the topics we were going to be talking about. And so I decided, probably mostly out of fear and also out of desperation to need to book the space and work with you, to not tell you what the podcast was about. And so when we started recording, I feel like I kind of threw you in the deep end, and you were likely being exposed to conversations and people and experiences that you could not have anticipated. So I'm curious, like, how did it feel listening to those conversations on that first day of recording, or what was your initial response when we started working on this project together?
I actually remember this pretty well. And you're right. It was, I'm actually surprised that we hadn't discussed. I didn't even ask you because I think it was pretty short notice, or I don't remember why. But yeah, so I press record. And then I remember your first words were you asked your first guest, how they identify. And it was like either fat. I don't remember what the spectrum was, but there were different words. And I was like, oh, wow, I had never heard that word being reclaimed in that way. And I didn't also know what the podcast was about. But then I got really interested. I was kind of like, okay, I can't wait to hear where this goes, because it is something that I struggle with. And I think a lot of people struggle with just their bodies in general. And, whether you identify as fat or not, I think the majority of people struggle with their bodies. Being in the queer community, I just am being pretty open. I'm into these conversations and I just love them and I love talking about it. So when I heard at first, I was like, okay, this is a fun one. I didn't even know this existed or people were talking about this. I mean, obviously they do. I just never really thought about it. And I was like, okay, let's listen. I'll take care of the volume, but I'll also hear what's to say.
I feel like the conversations that we had in season 1 are very emblematic of the type of complex and depth or complexity and depth that occurs in fat community and less so in mainstream conversation, because it just had pushed the envelope a little bit further beyond body issues into more of like a fat politic. So was there anything that stood out to you or sort of troubled you or confronted you in some way from the first season?
I don't remember that first episode specifically, but I do remember what my takeaways were. And I found it very helpful. There was something about just having listened to even just one episode that made me feel like I'm okay, just the way that I am. I know that's something that we hear a lot these days, but it's one thing to hear it and another one to feel it. But also just how can I, the whole ally thing, I never really thought of it. I never thought of being an ally to my fat friends. And I have been doing it so far. I'm conflicted with certain things, and maybe we'll talk about that a little later. But just, like if you're going to a venue, if you're going to a show, just asking those few questions if you can about like how the seating is, or when you're buying a ticket, is there a better option? Often there doesn't seem to be. So
not in Vancouver. It's a little tricky.
Yeah, don't go to the Vogue.
Oh, no, the Vogue is awful. The seats are awful. Just objectively, I think for most people, they're awful.
Yeah. In their defense, I don't think there's much they can do at the moment because everything's bolted down. But so I think that the biggest takeaway that to answer your question was that being a fat ally is a thing. And obviously it is. I just never thought of doing that. And I have fat friends. I grew up with, my mom was always larger. That was pretty hard sometimes, other like school kids making fun and stuff like that. So I have a history being around fat people and also it feels very homey. I don't know how to describe it. I don't know if that's okay for me to say, but I just do, like, I see someone, I'm like, I feel like, I don't know, there's probably some therapeutic part of this that you gravitate towards someone that's like your mom or dad. But I don't know where I'm going with this. But
did it feel validating in some ways to hear conversations that, a lot of the conversations, we can't help it, are highly emotional. So was it validating, I guess? And I want to tease apart that concept of hominess and comfort, where I think a lot of that can often have to do with validation and safety, and this idea that your experiences, especially ones that haven't always felt good or been particularly fun, to hear that other people can empathize, and also that people are sort of mobilizing in all these different ways to make those situations better. Like, is that perhaps where the foundations of that feeling comes from? Yeah,
definitely. I feel like it's nonstop of messages from every direction that if you gain a bit of weight or a lot of weight, don't worry, you can fix it. It's fixable. You just kind of go with that mentality of, okay, we're going to keto diet. And then when you make progress, then people will start complimenting, and they do. And then you gain the weight back and more. In fact, I was looking at, I have this scale that syncs to my phone, and often, because I'm trying to be better, so like if I use it, I don't look at it. I just step on. I just want the data like down the road if I need to, and I'm glad I did, because looking back at the past 6 years, it is literally like crash diet, like you could see it just like staircase up. And I'm like, what, what's going? But anyways, to answer your question, I think It's just this constant messaging that this isn't good enough. Unless you are like this, you're not good enough. And I should also say that, this is maybe amplified a little bit more. And by maybe, I mean most likely in the gay community. It's like you've got abs and you're looking good. Good. Plastic. Or you're a bear, and then that's the look that you have, and people like that too.
Yeah.
But there's something weird in the middle that
Yeah.
that is not defined. That is kind of an awkward place to be. But so yeah, having learning about this and talking about it, and we had many conversations after each recording. It gave me a lot more questions, but what was important to me is that it made me feel like, okay, I have someone to talk to about this. And also I don't have to hate myself. Like I don't have to, and I use that word not lightly. Like it's been like in high school, I had anorexia. Like there is some relationships with my body here that are clearly not great. But as I grow older, I'm kind of like, meh.
Yeah.
And this just, to me, like just hearing about this came at a good time. And I'm like, you know what? If I was not around other people, or in this city, I don't know if it's different elsewhere, who cares?
Yeah.
Like I would just be like, okay.
Yeah. There's something to be said about the turning point when you're introduced to conversations or materials, like on social media or whatever, but especially other people who are having these conversations that invites you into this more radical approach to your body that is so liberatory. And I think that in Vancouver especially, you really have to already be tapped into networks or connected, or it happens randomly. There's kind of no in between where you're by some miracle brought into this space, or you have proximity to someone who can do that for you. And I feel like there's so much to unpack in your last response about being gay and the gay community and fat stigma in that particular context. I mean, no fats, no femmes, I'm pretty sure originated on Grindr or gay dating apps, right? And how easy it is and how unproblematic it seems to be to say something like that, as if it's just a preference, and that as if preferences aren't highly political and problematic in many ways, right? It almost is like it stops the conversation right there instead of interrogating it or teasing it apart a little bit. And two, when you use the word better, like trying to be better, and then you talk about the data that you've collected that reveals to you what many of us know, which is that these fad diets and these harmful approaches to our bodies result in weight cycling, which actually has a much harder effect on the body than anything else, right? You're messing with your metabolism, your systems can't keep up, so they're going up and down, and then eventually research shows that your weight will continue to go up over time rather than decrease in any way.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to be said and sort of like teased apart there too about how we treat ourselves, and also that we continue to remain committed to these practices that ultimately in the long term and in the short term cause significant harm. It feels particularly insidious to gay community where these things seem to be, at least as an outsider's perspective, kind of the norm. Like it's like you're saying, if you're fat or if you're not sort of conventionally attractive in these ways, then you're put in these other camps, like you're a bear or you're whatever. And what happens if you exist in the gray area in between? You're kind of just left floating around trying to find your place, and the impact that can have on one's psyche when you A, feel like you don't belong, B, you're being told you're unattractive, and C, are also not even given the opportunity to be tokenized or fetishized in these ways. Like really, like where does that leave you? You know?
Yeah, a good question. I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack there, because a lot of our perception, or my perceptions anyways, of this are based off of my experiences, which might be, Grindr and if you're watching and you don't know what Grindr is, it's a dating app. And like the people on there are not necessarily like the community. But yeah, it is very like, you have to pick a category when you're on these apps. Like, are you, like, what are you? Right. And I actually even struggle all the time with the weight one. I'm like, what am I? As like, what is stocky, like large, stocky, like few extra. I'm like, what?
They're
Average.
so subjective too, right? If you're 6'5", 300 pounds is going to look very different than if you're 5'1".
Yeah.
Just regardless if it's muscle or fat or what have you, it's going to look different.
Yeah.
But you still have to choose these. I remember being on OkCupid years ago, and that's where I first saw, curvy or like a little extra or whatever. And now what I've found is that since I think those categories have been, it's been years since I've been on that particular platform. But what I've noticed now, especially in Vancouver, is that there's just coded language instead. So I've seen on people's profiles that they'll say active lifestyle. I'm looking for someone who takes care of themselves. I enjoy whatever. And that is all sort of like coded language for I'm looking for someone who isn't fat, because fat bodies are read as not those things.
Right.
And I really struggle with that because on dating apps, I kind of like oscillate between two extremes where I either am so forthright that I identify as fat, that I have very strong fat politics, et cetera, or I don't mention it at all.
Right.
And I don't know which one gives me more anxiety, because the first one seems very aggressive and it seems to put people off or make people terrified. And then the second one feels like it incites what I think are more common anxieties of being accused of catfishing, where you show up and maybe you don't look like your photos or you're fatter in person or what have you. And it just, I don't know, it's a really tricky thing to see where you land and how you can talk about it and then not be able to anticipate the responses of others. Like when I reached out to you, I had no idea what your politics would be. I had no idea that you were part of the queer community either. And so I was kind of like, no, when you hire someone, I had this conversation with myself where I was like, when you hire someone to do a job and they're professional, it doesn't really matter what the content is. So you don't have to get into the nitty gritty and get permission. You can just show up and do this thing. It's not like I'm recording a podcast that has problematic, violent content
Right.
in some way, right? Because I think there are lines. But I decided not to tell you what it was about because I also needed a place to film it. I needed it to be done well. And I also didn't want to be turned away because of the content. And that was like an active choice. And we make those choices all the time, whether that's on a dating app or professionally. How are we going to disclose this? How are we going to talk about it? And there's no clear answer in how to navigate these topics, which is what makes producing work like this podcast so interesting and fun and important, but also so incredibly difficult.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, a few things there for sure I have thoughts on. And just going back on the apps and what you were saying about like how to identify and stuff, I'm trying to really be objective about this because, the message that I'm hearing often from friends and everyone is that the gay community is very cutthroat in that world, right? I just don't know if that's maybe a little outdated because I've actually been finding it a lot easier as I'm gaining weight to find people in person who are more interested.
Interesting.
It is. I'm just kind of laying it out as like, this is fresh. This is like maybe a year old, like it was worth of, but, I'm just like, was my mom right? Like, she's like, oh, you look better with some extra pounds on. I'm like, Mom.
Do you think it's the pandemic? Do you think it's that a lot of our bodies have changed in the pandemic and now that we're starting to reemerge, not that the pandemic is over, but as people start to reemerge more and more in person, that collectively our attitudes as a society have changed about things like body size? Because I guess it's impacted more of us.
That's actually a good, I never thought of that. But yeah, because going out of COVID, I was like, oh my God, I don't want to see anyone because, I'd gained, at first we were like, oh, like COVID 20 or like in COVID 19, got there 19 pounds, whatever. And it was like, that quickly became like, okay, we can't really joke about that one anymore because it was like COVID 50. But I was seeing other people kind of going through I was about to say struggle. It wasn't really a struggle, but going through the same experiences that you are and seeing that that's normal, I was kind of like,
Yeah.
we're good. It was still something, there is still something to say about like gaining really fast that feels like that has more to process. Like, having to throw away your whole wardrobe and things like that. I didn't throw anything away, but you know what I mean? It's just,
Yeah.
there was some stuff during COVID, obviously, that like pushed everyone to whatever struggles they were having were just accelerated. But yeah, I don't know if that was related to COVID or not. Maybe I think COVID affected everything, so probably. But I also think that we're going through an awkward social media phase. And I don't think like apps, I'll just put apps into the social media kind of umbrella. But yeah, those apps, you have to represent yourself through words. You have to describe yourself in ways that you probably never had to in person. And then you're showing 2D pictures of yourself, and I'm always scared. I'm like, I ask my friends, do I look like my picture?
Yeah.
I've had someone show up once and be like, sorry, you don't look like your picture, and left. And then I have other people who show up and they're like, you look better than your picture. So I'm like, which one is it?
They actually left like right out of the gate.
Yeah, it happens. Yeah, I'll tell you that, like, this is why I don't want to base like the gay community, this is my community, on like gay apps, because that we get a lot of that. Now there is some validity to the whole, all the marketing material around like gay cruises and gay parties are just like guys with abs and and you know what, like I don't mind looking at it, I'll be honest. But I've discovered recently that I don't feel attracted to it. It was just almost like brainwashed that that's what you're attracted to. And then recently I was like, wow, you know what? I didn't feel much for that.
Yeah.
So it just kind of shows just how much, marketing does make a difference. But yeah, having to describe yourself and see like ask other people like, well, how do you see me, and put it out there, and then have other people on their end look at it and judge you based on that, show up and then judge you again and compare you to that's a lot.
Yeah.
And that's the part that I hate the most. If you meet someone in person, that's.
But it feels so. I was just talking to a friend of mine about this, that I almost feel like my generation, my social group, whatever, has accepted that if you're going to meet someone new, it's going to be through technology, because people just don't have these meet cutes in person anymore. And I feel like we very quickly accepted that, which it's interesting to hear you have this other perspective that brings more weight or focus on meeting people in person, and how, I think for a lot of people, the goal to meet people through technology is to eventually have a connection in real life. And so at some point you're going to make that transition. But I think for a lot of folks, it can feel really terrifying, because like you said, to have someone come to meet you and then immediately leave because they have decided that in person you are not what they are looking for is really harsh. And when you have the veil of those 2D images and the ability to sort of control the narrative and craft I want to call it a brand, because I think everyone on their Instagram feed, for example, has branded themselves in some way. Like, my favorite photos of myself are ones where I'm living in my van in the desert and I'm hiking and what have you. I'm not doing that every day when I'm in Vancouver. So I don't want to mislead people, about who I am. But at the same time, those are my favorite parts of myself, my favorite memories, and also just like the most beautiful photos. And so those are the ones I would want to include. But it's this like fine balancing act too around worrying, well, what is someone going to think if on the third date we just watch TV and order a pizza? Like, doing that in a bigger body is inherently received differently than when you're not. And there's just a lot of, at least for me, there's always been a lot of fear and anxiety about dating apps and meeting people online and then meeting up in real life, because I am terrified of that kind of rejection that is based solely, what feels like is based solely on my fatness compared to a conversation or a bad date or what have you.
I mean, when that happened, it was a horrible feeling. It's one thing to just talk about it now, but like, you know, when it happens, you're just kind of like, okay. It's pretty bad.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that it happened. I'm glad that it happened because if it happened again, I'd be like, not his cup of tea.
Yeah.
We're cool.
I always see it as like the trash is taking itself out, where if that's really how you're going to react to me, then you're doing me a favor by not wasting my time. But I would be lying if I were to say that it wouldn't also really hurt
Yeah.
in some way. Like it's got all these, again, like got all these layers to it.
You know what? It would have been nice. Because I mean, hey, if it doesn't work for you, don't force yourself to stay. I
Oh,
don't
yeah.
blame him for leaving.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Just give me some more information to work with. Like maybe try another picture because it doesn't look like yourself. As I want to know that. If you know, it's hard to tell because when we look at ourselves in the mirror, like we're looking at it from one angle,
Oh, totally.
right? So like to me, like when I look at a picture that looks like me to me from the front, then I'm like, that's what I look like. You
That's
know?
why I don't like seeing myself on video, because I'm like, that doesn't add up to what I thought. And it's not, I mean, in many ways, like it's just a weird experience to see
Yeah.
yourself from this third perspective instead of just from your own or what you can anticipate
Yeah.
from others. It's a really weird perspective to
Yeah.
navigate. But it's interesting to me too that and I correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that you identify as fat. And so it's interesting to hear from folks who have very similar perspectives and experiences, and then to also think about how that compounds as you move up or along the fat spectrum, and how other positionalities like race and class and disability and what have you, then also, not that it's the oppression Olympics, but that I want to acknowledge that we're sitting here having this conversation, and that can be incredibly amplified for others who have different positionalities than our own too, right? And I think that is sometimes what keeps people from having these honest conversations about how they feel and their experiences, because we don't want to be, especially with fatness, we don't want to be judged for having these feelings or experiences when we don't identify as fat or are on the smaller end of the spectrum, right? And so I can imagine as well, and I would love to know your thoughts on this because I don't want to speak for you, but listening to all of the conversations that were had in season 1 and then thinking about what that brings up for yourself and in your own life, was there any hesitation to feel entitled to those feelings or to want to talk about those feelings in some way? Like, do you feel like there's space for you in those conversations?
Interesting. This makes me think of the episode about fat yoga. And I was listening to it and I was like, I want to go. And my first question before even the guest left was like, am I allowed to come? And I do want to preface this by saying that I might not identify as fat, but I see myself as fat. A lot of people are just kind of like, oh, you're not fat, right? But you know, I wear hoodies and you know, I always kind of, I don't know, even people watching be like, oh, you're not fat. But, you know, I told someone once, one of my clients, because we were, you know, for dinner or something like that, I was like, yeah, like, you know, reach 250 pounds. They're like, you're not 250 pounds. I'm like, why would I lie about that? But it's just, you know, people carry weight in different ways. For me, it's not here. But anyways, so yeah, I do feel fat, but I don't identify it as because I know that I have some body dysmorphia, I guess is what we're calling it. So yeah, anyways, going back to that episode on fat yoga, which I still really would like to go. I was asking, you know, am I allowed to go, right? Because, you know, obviously I don't want to make anyone uncomfortable because I might not be seen the same way, but it would make me very happy to go because I don't feel accepted in the other places. So again, just kind of highlighting just how awkward it can be to be in the middle.
Yeah, to be in this middle ground.
Yeah.
With my Fats Only softball team, we have this conversation all the time because none of us feel like an authority in any way, shape, or form who gets to decide who identifies as fat and who doesn't. And so we've had some players who have lost weight or who have always been on the smaller end of the spectrum. And then we've had to navigate the feelings that has sometimes instigated with other players who are larger. Or even just as team leads, we've had to talk about preemptively sort of anticipating those feelings too and wanting to protect this like very sacred fats only space. And it's difficult because I never want to alienate someone from a community that could change their life in some way and make it better in lots of ways. And at the same time, wanting to or feeling very desperate to find the answers for that about how do we draw the boundaries and where is the line? Because with I think conversations about disability have navigated this fairly well in the sense that there's just this acknowledgement that some disabilities are invisible, that in many ways it's not necessarily a spectrum, but that there are many overlaps and it's not so clear cut. And I think with fatness, it's so sensitive. And there's also these very clear institutional and systemic experiences that only affect people in certain categories on the spectrum that we, like, for example, I always do my best to sort of acknowledge the privileges I have in the body that I have, where it's difficult for me to find clothing in this city. And sometimes it can be uncomfortable to sit on public transit, but there are some venues in the city where I can fit in the seats. And I know for some of my friends or people in my community, that is still a barrier to participation. And it's really tricky to know your place in those conversations. And and I'm not speaking just for you, I'm speaking for myself, that I have really struggled to know when should I participate in the conversation and when should I witness it? When should I use the privileges that I have to just create a space for those conversations? And when should I not be involved at all?
Yeah. And as you're saying that, I do want to point out that if that, sorry, I keep forgetting what her name is for the guest.
Helen.
Yeah. Helen. Yeah.
Helen's
okay.
great.
If we should mention her since we're talking about her. If Helen had said that this was more for people who identify as this type of fat, I would have been like, I get it. You know what I mean? Like it wouldn't have like, I wouldn't have been
Helen
like, oh,
struggled
shucks.
with that, right? Like I think Helen was like, I don't know how to draw the lines around who gets to sign up for my classes and who doesn't. So I let people self-identify. And I think that people who have like a come to Jesus moment where they realize that the class isn't for them will just sort of fade away. And I think that's a really gentle approach to this. And then sometimes you're in situations where you need to draw those lines and it feels impossible. And I think something that you said earlier, well, one thing I should add too is the episode with Tilly King, where they were talking about the fat clothing swaps and how they recognized that larger fats needed a larger fats only time beforehand. And that allies or non-fat folks at first could access a rack in the back or what have you, that there were really interesting ways to try out sort of creating those boundaries and parameters and trying to define these different spaces. But I think what makes this conversation really difficult is what you said before about feeling fat. Because I think a lot of people have said, including myself when I was younger, have said at some point in time, I feel fat. And often, and I'm not saying this is how you used it, but often how people use that is as almost like a synonym for other feelings. So I'm feeling bloated, I'm feeling in pain, I'm feeling tired, I'm feeling unattractive, I'm feeling whatever. And it kind of becomes encapsulated in this like feeling of feeling fat.
Right.
Which makes it really tricky because I've had lots of conversations with students or other folks who are being introduced to fat politics or fat studies and have never identified as fat, but feel very strongly that they should be a part of these conversations because they have felt fat or they feel fat. And I think that is also what makes it a really sensitive conversation because there are some folks in fat community who feel very strongly that should not be an entry point of participation and dialogue. And then there are some folks who have a little bit more space for empathy for that too, and to invite that into the room. And then there are folks who I think probably oscillate every day between feeling like that is an entry point and then feeling like that is offensive. And so it makes all of these conversations that we're having just really difficult and contextual and also very fragile.
I mean, it's pretty clear in my head now. I mean, I've had time to think about it, and I've listened to the whole season. But I think I am, first of all, a fat ally. Mm-hmm. You know, that's what I got from listening to season 1, and that's what the term that we're using, right?
As ally?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
yeah.
And so, like, you know, things that really affect someone, like not being able to go to a show. Mm-hmm. Like I was buying tickets for laugh, and I'm like, who do we invite? And I'm just like, you know, I don't want to. This is where I'm torn. I don't want to not invite someone, but also I don't want to put them in a situation where I invite them and they say they can't come because of the seats. So that's another part. But first and foremost, I'm a fat ally. Mm-hmm. And then I also feel fat. And, you know, it's, you know, I'm like 5'9", 250 pounds. Like I'm not like just feeling bloated. I think I'm just kind of like a little bit more on the cusp, but I'm like, not like, I don't think someone would look at me and say like, you're fat. Mm-hmm. It's like, you're chubby or bearish. Right. But there's so much that I'm learning from this podcast or from this type of movement anyways. Mm-hmm. So to me, it's clear that I can be helpful and I can learn. Mm-hmm. And they're pretty clear in my mind. Mm-hmm. And I like to be able to do something to make it better for my friends. Like I know my friend Gio has said in the past, he's like, you know, I don't like it when people say, like, if he's on a diet or something, and they say, wow, you look great. Mm. He's like, I didn't look great before, or like, you know, like things like that. And you know, saying things like you look, I like to say things like you have a glow to you today, like you look happy. And generally speaking, if people are making progress in whatever direction they are trying to make progress in, they'll look happy. Like that's just normal, right? So it's just kind of one of those things that is just being mindful on how you're talking to people, right?
Yeah, I find it really difficult because I've had friends embark on weight loss journeys and talk about how they feel better. And there's this part of me that wants to tease apart in some way that when we become closer in proximity to something like thin privilege and the privileges that are afforded to smaller bodies, of course we're going to feel better. It's sort of like if someone were to move up in social class, of course having more money means less stress. It means better housing, better opportunities for food, whatever.
Right.
And I think that both of those things are real. Someone is going to be feeling better, and ultimately what we want for the people we love is for them to be happy and secure and what have you. And then also these like broader, more theoretical or political conversations about why that is or what needed to happen in order to achieve that. And it's not easy. It's not easy to have those conversations. You said something too about how you identify as an ally, and then also, I think it's really interesting as well that you are existing in this tricky space where you are an ally to the fat community and you're actively trying to be supportive and create a better environment for fat folks. And then at the same time, when you talk about feeling fat, those feelings are supported by experiences that you've just disclosed, such as being rejected right off the bat from a date.
Yeah.
And so, or having someone immediately negate your weight because they just want to shut it down the conversation right away. And it's sort of denying the reality of your physical self. And so I think there's more to be said about the concept of feeling fat and how people might relate to or identify with fatness as a political identity or as a community or what have you, especially when people can, I mean, fat stigma affects us all, right? Even if you're thin, it affects us all. And I think when we have experiences that align more with those in fat community than those who aren't, that's what makes it impossible to exclude folks from the conversation, right? Like, it's important to still validate and process and discuss these things. But I do think that there's a lot of resistance to allowing that. And I think part of it is this sort of neoliberal watering down of fat activism into body positivity, and fat folks, desperation to protect it and to keep it from becoming something that's just sold back to us at some point, right? Like this idea, yeah, sure, everyone should love themselves, but like some of us literally are being killed by the medical system and what have you, and so we are not the same kind of thing. And I understand the importance of that, and then I also really understand the importance of transgressing those boundaries a little bit and trying to navigate these muddy waters, so to speak.
Yeah. The whole love yourself messaging to me these days doesn't mean anything. We just hear it so much everywhere, and very little of it feels genuine to me.
Yeah. I want to ask, did anything from the first season make you uncomfortable?
Uncomfortable? I don't know. There were some certain things that I want to find out more about.
Like what?
Like I'd like to learn more about being like fat and fit, you know, can I be like, what can I do? Because I feel like if I right now try to just eat clean and stuff like that, I'll probably just naturally lose weight. So I just would like to, like, for example, I look at my mom, and she's older and has mobility issues, right? So, and I know that it's a part because of her weight, because she has knee problems, and it's kind of adding to it. So I can't help but try to like understand how certain things apply blanket to everyone. And I think that obviously they don't. I think everyone's different. So yeah, I guess it's just things that I just want to learn more about, you know, like I think that like when the episode about the lady who was trying to have a baby just sounded so horrible. Like her experience just sounded so frustrating, and I don't know, frustrating is not the right word, aggravating. But yeah, I don't know how to answer that question. I guess it was just a lot of things that I just want to learn more about, you know?
Yeah, it's interesting that one of the points you've brought up is the relationship between fatness and physical fitness.
Yeah.
Because I feel like in my work, when I've been invited to give a guest lecture or if I've been interviewed by folks, often what they're asking me to do is prove using peer-reviewed research that fatness is not a threat to one's life, that you can be fat and healthy, to dispel all of these myths about fatness. And there's a part of me that wants to be able to do that. I want a one-pager or a pamphlet that I can hand out that discredits a lot of these really harmful myths that dictate how fat people are treated by doctors, by teachers, by their friends, what have you. And then there's this, I think, larger part of me that politically really feels that people should have body autonomy, and body autonomy is not that straightforward. I've been trying to sort of have a more sophisticated response rooted in disability justice and disability studies that talks a lot about healthism and this idea that no one owes anyone good health, that it's okay to not be healthy. And it's again, I feel like this entire episode is just us going in circles saying it's complicated, but
It is.
It really is, because I think that everyone has a right to do what they want to do with their own body. And
Absolutely.
If someone wants to eat a particular way or engage with fitness or physical activity in a particular way, that they can. And yet we can go in circles also dispelling or trying to tease apart why we might want to do things a certain way or why we think that those are the best ways to do things. And it kind of, I remember when I was introduced as a young feminist in my undergrad to these questions about or the concepts of false consciousness and double consciousness, and this idea that it is kind of inherently anti-feminist to question why someone is doing something. And at the same time, there are very valid conversations to be had about why we do things the way that we do, or why we want to do things the way that we want to do them. And it's hard to have these conversations. Even, my interview with Helen about yoga is difficult because it really rubs up against these tricky conversations that are also highly emotional. We have a lot of feelings invested in them and in response to them, right? And it's not easy to navigate those because when someone asks me a question and they want me to tell them right away that being fat doesn't mean that you're unhealthy, it almost feels like I'm abandoning the parts of my community who I stand in solidarity with, where for whatever reason, health is not an option or a priority to them. And it's hard because there's a part of me that wants to talk about and dispel a lot of the problematic and incorrect research that has paired fatness with certain conditions or what have you. And at the same time, I don't want to deny the reality that someone's fatness, like your mom, as you just described, might impact their mobility and that they might not enjoy that and that might not be their ideal situation. We all live in an ableist society that is inherently inaccessible. And so I understand the desire to want to increase one's mobility as much as possible. And how do you have these conversations in a way that doesn't hurt someone or leave someone out? When it comes to weight loss, or when it comes to people's feelings about their bodies, I find it really hard to have that next step in the conversation because there's a lot of research that shows that about 95% of attempts to lose weight will fail or will result in weight cycling, where people end up eventually 5 years down the road or longer at a higher weight than when they started.
Absolutely.
And so when I hear my friends talk about being unhappy with the size of their bodies, my approach wouldn't be, well, what should we do about it? Mostly because it feels like you're setting them up to fail. And so I think it's this really complicated dance you have to do where you don't want to discredit how they're feeling. And you, of course, want to help them feel better or support them in feeling better. And then at the same time, that's been this sort of awkward position I feel like I've been in as I've moved, especially through my academic work, where I'm okay, I fully support you in whatever you want to do. And then sometimes I'm well, the behaviors you're engaging with statistically are ineffective, or, this different diets are just kind of masked eating disorders or disordered ways of eating or whatever. Right. And so especially in Vancouver, where there's a lot of discourse around eating organic or eating keto, or even the concept of clean eating is very closely linked to orthorexia and all these concepts of purity and whatever that are myths, right? And so it's hard to know when to stay in your lane and just be supportive, and then also be I don't want to see there be more harm caused. And I think that's what makes me so excited about this podcast and projects like it, is that you are being brought into these very different industries or issues in a way that might also present opportunities or things to you that you didn't realize were options. So for example, for people who might have always approached exercise from a place of discipline and punishment, to hear Helen talk about fat joy and what do they call that? Joyful movement is great. Or, even with Kaylee's episode about all of her horrible experiences with fertility clinics, to also then hear about her path and how she found, I believe it was a naturopath who worked with her, and now she's ovulating, and it's really sort of flipping the script on what was happening with those first few clinics. Also gives people the opportunity to say, oh, well, maybe there are other options when a door is closed for me or what have you.
There's always another option.
Yeah, there's always another option.
You're or not. I'm there's always another option.
And I think that's with fatness and health, right? If we're told that being fat is bad and we can't argue with that because it means that it's threatening your life or what have you. like when we move away from that very rigid and narrow perspective and start to have conversations about, well, what else could this thing look like? Like this season, we're talking to two community organizers who host Juicy Gems, which is a fats only cabaret. And this idea that like even,
juicy.
yeah, exactly. And that even, performance in the sense of burlesque doesn't always have to look this one way. And what does it mean? And then also teasing apart the politics of that. I appreciate the way that these conversations fragment. And I also appreciate talking to you today, and that we might have differing opinions or even just different entry points to this conversation, but we're able to meet in the middle and talk about it. And I think that, just to return to how we began this interview, there aren't many opportunities to have dialogue like that feels a little messy or sensitive or free from the risk of punishment if you make a mistake or say the wrong thing,
agree.
which I think keeps people from talking about these things. And it just feels, I think it feels nice to be teasing this apart with you too. And your perspective is really valuable, despite the fact that where you were at when we started this project was very different than where you're at even now as we begin season 2.
Absolutely. I think if people have questions, ask them. If you have opinions, present them politely, and be open to receive another. And there's it's so bad these days. It's just like it's just scary you don't know who to talk to and who's going to react how. And I understand that there's a lot of hurt. But these are important conversation, okay? It's true. It's important to push a little so that this podcast hopefully creates other conversations. And what we have here was just, the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg.
Well, thank you very much for talking with
You're
me.
welcome.
I appreciate it, and helping open up the season for season 2.
Thank you. That was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
This podcast is produced and directed by me, Layla Cameron. Both audio and video versions of this podcast were edited by Ari Conrad Birch. Each interview was filmed and audio recorded by Rami Mikhail. Additional video was filmed and edited by Felix Naud and directed by ETW Media Productions. The music for this season is by the band Parlor Panther. Funding for this podcast is supported by TELUS STORYHIVE.